Hail, viewers. Today, I would like to talk about Final Fantasy Spirits Within. Many of you, peradventure, have seen my videos pertaining to Final Fantasy VIII. In my quest to understand Final Fantasy VIII even more, I've decided to read Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, essentially the last great project of, that was under the direction of Hironobu Sakaguchi. To me, that was very important to understand more about what Final Fantasy was. I've investigated so many aspects of essentially the belief that I and many other people have in regarding Griever, Rinoa, being Ultimecia, all of these different aspects of the mysterious Final Fantasy VIII story. And so, there came a time when I started to think, I need to understand more about what Final Fantasy, and what ideas Final Fantasy really promotes about summons, guardian forces. And so when I started to read Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, I also watched the movie. You can find this on Tubi. You can watch it for free. The one on YouTube is not free. As far as I know, they do show it on YouTube, but you have to pay for that. So if you come to Tubi, you can watch Final Fantasy The Spirits Within for free. Now, that movie, during its time, when it first released, it was incredibly... The graphics were incredible for its time. And to some extent, they still are pretty good. Even in 2025, you have to remember this was a movie that released, as far as I know, during the early 2000s. As far as I know. But it was a movie that was oddly... Let me put it this way. This might as well be a review as well of Final Fantasy Spirits Within. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within was a very ambitious project, I have to say, and it had a lot of concepts in it. Let me put it this way. In many Final Fantasy games, we are often bombarded with a good deal of concepts that have a great deal of lore. For example, let us use the archetype, the archetypical Final Fantasy VII, which, the original, of course, not the remake. When you think about that story, it was awfully complex. You had Mako, you had Materia, you had this idea that somehow Gaia was the planet, and Gaia had all the substance of all the souls and spirits sort of going into it, of all the life forms that were on the Earth. And the idea in Final Fantasy VII was that the Earth, that Gaia, which means Earth in Greek, which is considered a goddess of feminine, of a feminine aspect, in relation to what they consider the masculine sky, the god Uranus, or whatever you would call him. One moment. Excuse me. Anyhow, it was a very nature-oriented game in regard to, when you look at the theology, the in-game theology, it was not really outright stated. But you can see it was both animistic to a degree. In other words, they believed everything, the earth itself to them had a soul. And so when you read Final Fantasy Spirits Within, you encounter that very much expressed. The same thing was expressed in the movie, but when you read the book, I think it is sort of expressed even more so. Now, I believe Dean Wesley sort of helped write that, and they used the screenplay as inspiration. The book is very true, I suppose. The movie is very true to the book, the screenplay or whatever you would call it. Though I would have to say that when you read the book, even when you're reading the book, I would say it is still overwhelming in terms of all the concepts. Let me put it frankly. When I first played Final Fantasy XIII, and some of you may have done so, if you have not done so, Final Fantasy XIII was a game where you were, right when you started playing the game, you were bombarded with different concepts, with different ideas. When you watch the Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, or you read the book, you're bombarded with all types of different concepts. You're bombarded with phantoms, aliens, alien races, which they never go into detail about. You are also, presented with all manner of technology. They talk about spirits. They talk about, basically all of these concepts are given to you one after another in a very short period of time. And I think what was good about Final Fantasy VII and the games, in other words, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and to some extent even 10, I think that after 10, Final Fantasy as a series started to become a very confusing thing. So much so that I really do not think it was really even... It was not as good, let me put it that way. It was definitely not as good. It is not as good today. Some people talk about Square Enix. When they became Square Enix, people say, well, it changed. And it did. Hironobu Sakaguchi started the franchise with the idea that was going to be his final game, his final fantasy. They did not know if the company was going to continue. So there was a lot of passion behind that for Hironobu Sakaguchi, and only one person, I believe, could properly lead it. So when it became Square Enix, once Sakaguchi was basically fired or laid off or whatever you would call it, Final Fantasy started to change. After Final Fantasy X was released, Final Fantasy X, the sequel, was released. This was heresy to a lot of us because we thought, oh my goodness, Final Fantasy has never had a sequel. And it just continued. You had Final Fantasy 11, which was something that Square, Square had planned to do for a long while, which personally I don't have so much of a problem with. But you had Final Fantasy 12. I didn't particularly like that game. I have my reasons for not liking it. But after Final Fantasy 12, you had I believe it was a 3DS sequel. You had Final Fantasy 12 Revenant Wings. Alright? Then you had Final Fantasy 13. After Final Fantasy 13 there was Final Fantasy 13 2 and Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns. You had a whole literal trilogy, which, interestingly enough, in my opinion, is still better than Final Fantasy 16 just as a game. Final Fantasy 16 was pretty terrible to me. Final Fantasy 15 was also not something I liked. But nonetheless, basically, for the most part, we did not really receive that in the mainline games. The first, the big three, 7, 8, 9. And Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, for the most part, you were not overwhelmed with information. Information sort of came in at a very steady pace. You kind of learned things, but you learned them in a very measured way. I mean, you would learn about Midgar, what it was, President Shinra. You would learn about, okay, this is the idea about the planet, and Barrett is explaining who the Avalanche is. And for the most part, you had a lot of time to absorb the information. What Final Fantasy Spirits Within is a lot different than that. Even the book. Information is just presented to you all at once, and the information is very grave. It's like, alright, it's, basically the world has been destroyed by these aliens, and there's phantoms, and they're like these spiritual beings that don't have bodies, but if they touch you, you die. And it was kind of weird. It's almost though, wait, all they have to do is just touch you one time and you die? Yes. And they'll corrupt your spirit, and you're just... there was something philosophical about it. There was something... esoteric about it, but at the same time, you couldn't really appreciate the information because it was just coming at you too fast. And I think that was the problem with the movie. That is why you hear so many Final Fantasy players, when they watch the movie, they say, this probably would have been good if it were a game. Because as a game, many of us know Hironobu Sakaguchi would be able to measure that information out. But even in regard to the book, I think the book was also pretty terrible. They say the book was written off the screenplay. And right when you're reading the book, the first thing they're doing is trying to fight. They're not trying to fight anything, but the woman, whatever her name is, I forget her name. The main character, the woman, the pretty woman, alright, the Asian woman, she decides to find what she says is a spirit. Because apparently she needs these spirits because her body was touched by a phantom, or she was infected by a phantom. And so she has to find these spirits. So that's the whole point of the book. That's the whole point of the movie. Eventually things sort of go downhill, so to speak, because you have different people, who are part of the military. They want to shoot a giant cannon, in the center of the planet or something. They want to, and you have the scientist, he's telling them, don't shoot the cannon at the planet. The Earth has a soul, and if you hit the planet with the cannon, it's going to hurt the planet. This was the idea that we saw a lot of in Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VIII was a bit unique because Final Fantasy VIII did not really have an environmental idea behind it. Interestingly enough, that's probably one of my favorite. But I do think Final Fantasy VII was the most like Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. However, I could see elements, and I say this very seriously, that Hironobu and whatever team he had, who had come up with Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, had in that movie that you could trace into Final Fantasy VIII, even though Final Fantasy VIII had different, basically, Hironobu Sakaguchi was busy working on the movie, while Final Fantasy VIII was being overseen by different people in the Square Enix, in the Squaresoft company. Goodness, I said Square Enix, which I despise Square Enix. I love Squaresoft. But anyhow, it was a pretty amazing endeavor. But let me put it this way. The idea, all of their sort of ideas about spirits in the franchise, or at least in Final Fantasy VIII, in terms of spirits like guardian forces, like being, there were a lot of things that did not make sense when I first played Final Fantasy VIII. Quistis tells Squall, when you're first in the classroom, she says, hey, go to your computer and get your guardian forces. And I said, how can you get a guardian force from a computer? And so they're taking these guardian forces and doing all types of things with them. They're drawing them out of monsters. They're talking to them. In some cases, the guardian forces are talking. In some cases, the guardian forces, you just fight them and you get to put them in your body. Now, they can even go on computers, and you learn that in the first part of the game. And you have to ask, what are these guardian forces? And the obvious answer is that guardian forces are spirits. And so Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within is quite significant because you're able to understand what the Squaresoft team, what they mean when they use certain concepts like this. So we did not have the environmental theme in Final Fantasy VIII, but at the same time we had that concept of spirits. Now Final Fantasy VII, that completely had all of the points that Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within had in the movie. In other words, the idea about environmentalism, the planet has a soul, the planet has a life, all of that type of talk. So, I suppose I might as well talk about something related that may surprise some of you. but since I happen to know a lot of things that most people don't know, I can talk about a subject that is somewhat interesting. Now, in my comment section, I put all types of things in my comment sections, as you know, and so don't worry about this. This is not really, significant. It's just some word study, but I wanted to see. Let me see. I had something here, because I post biblical things sometimes in my comment section. In the Wisdom of Solomon, which is an apocryphal, it is a book in, that is in some Bibles. It's called the Apocrypha. Many people take it seriously. I do. There's a book called the Wisdom of Solomon. In the Wisdom of Solomon is said, "For thine incorruptible spirit is in all things." It also says, "For the Spirit of the Lord filleth the world, and that which containeth all things has knowledge of the voice." In other words, the idea was being presented here is that the Lord, His Spirit is in all things. That's why He can hear you. That's why He knows your thoughts. That's why He knows everything about you. That's why, He has complete knowledge, because His Spirit is in all things. And therefore, this was in the Wisdom of Solomon. So, many people think Christians don't really have an understanding of what may be called animism. In other words, they don't really believe. And a lot of them don't, but since I know and have read the Wisdom of Solomon and can understand that if you're omnipresent, you need to sort of be present everywhere. Your spirit has to be present everywhere, so your spirit has to fill the whole world. So that would be the whole of His creation. I mean, so for me, it's easy to understand a lot of the Shintoistic, animistic ideas of Hironobu Sakaguchi. I can understand the significance of them and why he puts such an emphasis upon them. Now, I can just have that degree of understanding because I know that basically we have, as Christians, that understanding also portrayed in our scriptures, which some people may be unaware of, but it's true. So anyhow, the movie is all about that. It's all about this understanding that, you can't hurt the planet with this big cannon. It's a big weapon. And so there are some military people in the movie. They believe if they shoot these aliens that have burrowed into the planet from some other world or what have you, it's very much like the Genova idea. And the idea, there's also sort of a canon in Final Fantasy VII that they use Mako energy that they make with, they make it to fire Mako energy. Mako energy in Final Fantasy VII is some type of spiritual energy that they say is connected to all people, all life forms on the planet. So basically the whole conflict there is when they make the cannon, they think it's going to help them defeat these things called weapons that apparently the planet has summoned to defend itself against harm being done to it by Genova, Sephiroth, and so there's this whole dynamic of this environmental religion. It's very interesting, but basically that is what Final Fantasy The Spirits Within is primarily about. The movie suffers from the fact that there are too many concepts being presented. You cannot understand and appreciate the movie because of, for one thing, let me say this. The movie is more of a horror movie. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within is kind of a horror movie because it's really shocking. You have phantoms, which are like these beings. They're like ghosts. They're not material. They can move through walls. If they touch you, you die. They just take your spirit out of your body and I guess eat it or something. And it's really disturbing. And it was scarier than I thought anything. I think for a lot of Final Fantasy players, when they first watched the movie and when they saw it when it first released, they just thought, this is terrible. This is traumatic. This is going to give me nightmares. Because all these creatures had to do all these phantoms had to do was touch you, and you died. They were able to literally, if you got touched by them and you were able to free yourself somehow, and run, you still would get infected. In other words, whatever weird spiritual energy they had would infect your whole body. It would literally infect your spirit and turn you into a phantom or something like that. So it was pretty terrible. The book is scary, the movie is scary, not in the sense that it's scary as in, hey, you see something, it's really terrifying. No, it's more or less like, it's that weird sense of suspense that you get when you know that they've put this massive enemy, these massive enemies in the movie that basically cannot be conquered. You can't defeat them. They're just, it's a very strange movie. And I think for a lot of Final Fantasy players, they were not expecting that. I personally can appreciate the movie and the book, but I don't like it. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but I'll put it this way. I know what they were trying to do. I know what Hironobu Sakaguchi was trying to do. He was trying to sort of, do that environmental message of Final Fantasy VII. Also sort of put some of his ideas about spirits in the movie, which, I think those ideas originated with Hironobu Sakaguchi. I am pretty sure, regardless of who's the writer, regardless of who's doing what, Final Fantasy has consistently sort of done this thing where essentially they act as, the narratives, it's even in Final Fantasy 15, the idea of, a technological advanced empire or civilization that is sort of using technology to the detriment of the planet and man and in the environment and the like. And the idea that, the old ways, magic and, fae folk, and I say fae folk, but these weird little magical beings and all of these things, nature and, paganism, this type of idea, hey, go back to nature. Technology is sort of, it's really destroying things, and you have people want power, and they're making big weapons, and they're trying to make bigger weapons so they can essentially take over the world, but their ambition is destroying the world. To put it frankly, the ideas behind Final Fantasy are not too hard to understand, but I would say the spiritual fan tried to mix horror in the movie, and that was not something necessarily done in, the Final Fantasy games. It was there, but it was subtle. For example, when you're playing Final Fantasy VII and you first get to go to the, the presidential building, and you're there, it's really surreal, and it's really done quite well. When Sephiroth takes Genova's head, and he leads that trail of blood, and you're following that trail of blood, and you're fighting these weird creatures, let me tell you, it was really disturbing. Now, in Final Fantasy VIII, they censored the blood, unless you get the uncensored ISO file that I used. And for me, I'm a Squaresoft purist. Those are the games that I like to play. I like to play the original classic games. Everything up to 9. 1, 2, 3, all of those. Okay, so for me, emulation has been a godsend. It's really exciting. Because those games, I no longer like Square Enix games. But let me just put it this way. There was a horror element in it. It was disturbing when you saw, during certain points of the Final Fantasy VII story. For example, when you're the Gold Saucer, and basically Barrett leaves your party, I think, and basically someone has been killed. And you're trying to figure out, okay, someone has killed someone, and people think it's Barrett, so Barrett is sent to, I think he was sent to prison under the Gold Saucer. And so there was this type of horror element to that, because you kind of wondering, oh, is Barrett the strong, big guy? Has he really killed someone? You didn't know. Hironobu Sakaguchi was masterful in his production of video games, but I think in regard to this movie, it was just a little too it veered away from what was done in the video games. And I think had this been done as a game, maybe it would have been better. Unfortunately, that is not the case. We all know how that turned out. And so, basically, you know, this movie and the book, I was able to learn a lot from it in terms of just, okay, I needed some information about how Squaresoft dealt with spirits and spirituality, so to speak. What connection, what understanding can I gain from this in regard to how I understand Final Fantasy VIII and their guardian forces, which are essentially spirits? And I think at this point I can definitively say that guardian forces are spirits. I hope to do more work in that regard, but this was why the movie and the book were so important to me. As far as the movie and book are concerned, I would say, let me give my review score. Out of 10, I would give both works a 4 out of 10. Unfortunately, that is the score I have to give Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. As a product, a 4 out of 10. Because it's just too confusing, and the movie is providing too much information, and it's a lot of scientific information, it's a lot of spirituality type information that the viewer would rather see these things in practice rather than someone explain it to them and just go. It's a very scientific movie, and I think it has more scientific elements in it than it has the right to have. And I think for Final Fantasy, it was more about the battles. And for the Phantoms, they're the most terrifying enemy in Final Fantasy history, because all they have to do is touch you and your character dies. They don't care if it's the main character, they don't care if it's side characters. These are powerful enemies. This is like if we were to make a Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, this would be like the Dark Souls of the Final Fantasy series, because all you have to do, they can kill you in like one hit. And that's really how it is. It would be quite enjoyable, I think, if you could play a game like that, but unfortunately they decided to do a movie. I think this would have been far better as a game. And I think a lot of the people who were disappointed with Final Fantasy The Spirits Within are especially disappointed with that fact. I'm going to drink some water. One moment, viewers. But for sure, it was interesting, but it's not good. I enjoyed it when I saw it in terms of how weird it was, but I didn't think it was good. It was disturbing. It was a horror movie to me, not in a good way. It was both confusing and scary at the same time, and that was not a good mix. It was not a good mix at all. So, viewers, it was a joy to discuss this. May you be blessed, and farewell, viewers.